After listening to the children sing, I am tempted to sing rather than preach. But when they sing, they comfort the afflicted. If I sing, I will afflict the comfortable. Now, actually, somebody told me I have a heavenly voice. Actually, he said I have an unearthly voice. So I just presumed he meant heavenly voice. Okay, so all temptations come from either from the world, or from Satan, or from our flesh. The flesh is a way of saying our sinful nature. But sometimes we have a tendency to blame everything on Satan. I think we give Satan too much credit, for our sins. A lot of it actually comes from, our own sinful nature, our own sinful desire. And James here is talking about that. He's saying that ultimately, it doesn't come from, God. It doesn't come from Satan. But James is emphasizing the fact that it comes from our own sinful desire. Now, the Jews believed, since the Jews did have a tendency to believe rightly, in a sense, that everything comes from God, and therefore they believed, that even our sinful nature, comes from God. So there's one Jewish rabbi, and I'll quote him. He says, God said, "It repents me that I created the evil tendency in man." So this is a real bold and dangerous step, where the evil tendency in human beings is ultimately attributed to God himself. They said it comes from God. Now James is correcting that. James is saying, no. Temptation doesn't come from God. God cannot be tempted, and he doesn't tempt. And then he says, temptation comes to every man because he is seduced by his own, it says here, his own desire. Now, Christianity doesn't teach that all desires are evil. That's more like a Buddhist teaching, where Buddhism, or at least some forms of Buddhism, teaches that, that ultimately, it's one of the four truths, there is suffering, and suffering is caused, because of desire. So there is a tendency to view all desire as the problem. But that's not what Christianity teaches. The Bible says, that, it talks about the psalmist desiring God above everything else. Oh, how I long, how my soul thirsts for God. And at the Lord's Supper, Jesus himself said, oh, how I long to take part, how I desired to take part in this meal, with you people. So not all desires are evil. So the key word is, our own desire. The idea is, that it's talking about sinful desire. Our desires can be very selfish. Our desires can be dominated by self-interest. Our desires can be dominated by having our own way. Our desires may be dominated by us wanting to become like God. And that, I think, is the ultimate sin. Our desire for autonomy. I think that's the ultimate sin. Our desire to have autonomy from God. To be separate from God. To act and be like God. I think this is the essential nature of sin. And so, you want to have, this desire, to be like God, to have your own way. I did it my way, It may be good for Frank Sinatra. And I like Frank Sinatra, So I have to be careful, what I say. But you get my point, right? So actually the biblical way is that I did it his way. Not I did it my way. I did it God's way. And here it talks about what happens, with sin. It says, it talks about the genesis of sin. It says that, when, we are seduced by our own desire. And then look at the language. Again, it's, very graphic. Then desires conceives and gives birth to sin. And when sin has reached its full development, it brings forth death. Death in all its forms. So it's a very graphic description of death. It's talking about the desire conceiving sin in one's womb, and then it begets sin, and then it brings in the end it leads to death. Now today, we tend to downplay sin. We use different words for sin. We say instead of sin, we use a word like mistakes, and so on. And I think it's good for us to give the correct label. So even if you don't want to use the word sin, but we need to know the gravity of sin, and we need to use words that would show the gravity of sin. I was once having a Bible study, and we were talking about, Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante's, it talks about, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. So we were talking about, Dante's description of hell. But of course, Dan Brown, he has a book called The Inferno, and in which it does talk about Dante's Inferno. Of course, I like Dante better than Dan Brown. But so one of the persons in the Bible study who was quite intelligent, very well read, but she has not read Dante's Dante's Inferno, but she had read Dan Brown's Inferno. And she said, based on Dan Brown's Inferno, she was saying, it's horrible, Dante's Inferno. So for her, it was something that is negative. And here I am praising her, but she's challenging me. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You challenge your teacher, and that's wonderful too. But you need to give the basis, for why you are, challenging. So she said, it's horrible. So I told her, you're saying, how did I put it? You don't like Dante because he calls horrible things horrible. I mean, how can, as if hell is not horrible? Whether you believe in hell or not, that's a different question. But hell by definition is something that horrible. And so she is saying, Dante makes it horrible. Of course, hell is horrible. So she's blaming Dante for making horrible things horrible. Of course, some people say that, because in hell there are so many rich people that now they have installed air conditioned and so on, that it is cool and nice and so on. But that's a joke, But, so, horrible things, let's call it by its true name. So sin is sin. It's a terrible thing. His definition about what it does to us, what it does to the human person. So I do believe, that a lot of our problem starts with language. George Orwell, in his 1984, he talks about Newspeak, in which he talks about, it starts with language. You start changing language, you start changing the way you think about reality, about nature. And so, here again, sin. It's a fault, it's a mistake, and so on. No, but let's call it by its real name. That this is something that is terrible. It is something that is drastic. Think of in your house. You have children, young children, in your house, and then you have a poison bottle. Now, the milder the label, the more dangerous it is. Can you imagine you put on a poison bottle honey? That's dangerous. Better to call it poison, right? The milder the label, the more dangerous it is. So we laugh off at sins, we make fun, we make jokes about sin, we try to reduce, the gravity of sin as if it's okay. Well, James and the Bible, they call it by what it is. So there are desires in each one of our lives that is not okay. There are desires in each one of our lives that results in spiritual death. There is a test that have been done. I'm not too sure if it's correct, but I've heard it said that frogs, if you put frog in a hot water or in a warm water, it will jump outside immediately, because it's hot. But then, they say, again, I'm not too sure, they say that, but if you put a frog in a water and you heat the water slowly, then the frog will get used to the warmth of the water. It'll even begin to feel good and nice about the water until the water becomes hot and boiling and it is completely, boiled. Where you have that kind of a thing. In India, I come from Kerala. In India, this is how they catch monkeys. They make in a green coconut, buko, in a tender coconut, they make a hole on top and they scrape out some of the flesh and then they just leave it there, and along comes an unsuspecting monkey and it puts its hand inside. And then it holds on to the flesh, and then, the trapper or the monkey trap or the monkey hunter comes, and the stupid monkey, instead of letting go of the flesh and escape, it would hold on to the flesh and try to escape with the, because it cannot remove its hand, outside. So it's trying to escape with the green coconut. Naturally, it cannot run fast. It becomes an easy target. That's what we do. We hold on to things that, that may be bad for us. We hold on to things that is actually our enemy. We hold on to things that creates a problem for us and for our loved ones. Sin is never something that just hurts you. It does hurt you, but it also hurts others, So a drunken father, who gets drunk and he's not working, he would come home, beat his wife or his children, or since he cannot work, it affects his family. So sometimes because of sin, we have to face the consequences of sin, but sometimes it affects, it hurts our loved ones, just like a drunken driver. He runs over pedestrians. It's because of not the sin of the pedestrians, it's because of the sin of the driver. It affects others. So sin is a communal, it's a communal thing. It's not just an individual thing. So there is a fight between us, for the good tendency and for the evil tendency. What do? There is a story told about an American Indian chief. He used to have parang sabong, where people bet on the dogs. Here it's another, it's on the fighting cocks, the derby. But this is, so he had a black